Hello there and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana channel. As you can see, I'm joined once again by author, researcher, scholar, Mr. Ralph Ellis. And I've been looking forward to this for a while because today I'm going to be putting your questions to Ralph on all things history. So, how are you, Ralph? All right?
Very well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me back on again.
Pleasure. Okay, so our first question comes from Agatha Velvet. And the question is, Ralph, what was the main mission of Josephus Flavius and who was he working for?
In a word, greed. And there was only one person he was ever working for, and that was himself. He's Mr. Machiavelli, basically. Everything revolved around Josephus. I get the impression, I can't prove it. I mean, he was an aristocrat. He was royal. He was descended from the Hasmoneans. I get the impression that he thought he should be, as it were, on the throne instead of these Edessan kings. And therefore, he was going to use any trick in the book to attain that position. And if that meant working with the enemy, yes, he would work with the enemy. So he was a Mr. Quisling from... Where was Mr. Quisling from? He was from Sweden, wasn't he? Yeah, he was a traitor working for himself. And if he could involve the Romans in order to get back his position of power that he thought he should have, then he would do that. And that's exactly what he did. He worked... I think he was working alongside the Edessan royals to start with. But he was rejected by them, and that upset him a little bit. So he started working for the Jerusalem establishment, the priesthood in Jerusalem, who appointed him as army commander in Galilee. That's how he was able to be going around Galilee, arresting the proto-Christians. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Josephus was doing exactly the same. He was running around Galilee, chasing down Jesus of Gamala, Jesus of Cephius, who I think were the same person, and contending with them. And then, as he says himself, he was aggrandizing himself to the point of... so the power he had as the commander of Galilee had gone to his head. And the Jerusalem priesthood paid Jesus of Cephius and Jesus of Gamala an enormous amount of silver to go and capture him, because the commander had got out of control. This is Josephus Flavius, our wonderful historian, you know. And so his own paymasters, the Jerusalem priesthood, were paying other people to go and capture him. That's how bad it had got. And then, of course, when the opportunity arose, he swapped sides and joined the Romans, because now he had a powerful ally who could help him against the Jerusalem priest and against the Edessan royals as well. So yeah, Josephus was only ever working for one man, and that was Josephus.
Great answer. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, and our second question is also on Josephus. This one comes in from Davy Jones. And the question is, did Josephus Flavius get Nero's wife pregnant? And was this what started the Jewish war?
I do sort of hint at that. Yes, Davy Jones, a very good, very traditional Hebrew name, of course. For people who don't realize, the most popular name in Wales is actually a Hebrew name, Davy Jones. David Jonas. Yes, did Josephus Flavius get involved with the wife of Nero? Well, yes, he did. And he could have angered Nero sufficiently that, yes, He could have started the Jewish revolt, yes. What happened? Well, Josephus Flavius and Saul, both together, that's one of the reasons why I say they're a conflated person, just one person called Saul Josephus, was sent to Rome on a prison ship, which was wrecked in a storm, and they landed on Malta. They crash landed on Malta, with the boat was broken to pieces, and eventually they were saved and they were taken on a boat to Naples and then to Rome to go and see Nero. So both of these characters, Judea, were being sent to go and see Nero, and they did. But Josephus Flavius says he became a friend of Poppaea, who was the wife of Nero, sufficiently so that she gave him a load of presents. Now, it was known in Rome that Poppaea had a propensity for young men. She was well known for having a whole harem of young men. And it doesn't seem beyond the realms of possibility that Josephus was one of those young. That's why he got all the presents from Poppaea. And remember, he would have been 25 at this time. So he was still a virile young man. And yeah, it's likely that he one of Poppaea's special friends. But Nero eventually, because she got pregnant, Poppaea got pregnant, and it was said that Nero kicked his wife to death because she was pregnant. She was kicked in the stomach until she died, which sort of suggests that he didn't approve of that pregnancy, sort of. And what does Josephus do? Well, he just skips out of Rome, disappears back to Judea, and never mentions the demise of his patroness, Poppaea. Just says, I got many presents for Poppaea and went back to Judea. Oh, well, thank you. And why would he suddenly go back to Judea? Well, because the Jewish revolt was just starting. And if the long arm of the Roman law was after him, then the safest place to be would be Judea, because not very long after this, of course, Judea revolted, and therefore the law of Rome didn't apply anymore. So it was a sensible place to go to. And Josephus doesn't mention the fire of Rome either, which is surprising because he was probably there at the time when the Great Fire of Rome happened. So one might suspect that the fire was not as bad as being claimed by Tacitus. So did that sort of start the Jewish revolt? Well, it couldn't have helped, could it? You know, it's putting Judea in a bad light. And yes, Nero might have been angered somewhat by all of these shenanigans. So yeah, we have no proof, as ever with history. All we have is the limited text that we're looking at, but it's entirely possible.
It's an interesting side note, yeah. Okay, let's move on from our friend Josephus now. Question number 3 comes in from Steve Moore, and the question is, what is the significance or secret of the South Sandwich Islands, which you refer to in Thoth, Architect of the Universe? Was that your first book?
Yes, it was. Actually, I mention it in K2. No, I do mention it in Thoth, Architect of the Universe, yes. This is rather a speculative part of my research into the megaliths of Egypt and Britain, Stonehenge and Avebury. And without going too deeply into it, if you look at Avebury, we have these enormous great megaliths which were designed to last for thousands of years. And Why were people building? What do they represent? Was it just a circular temple? Is it, temple to astronomy, as some people say, pointing at certain directions? If you look at Avebury in plan view, it looks awfully like a image of the Earth. So if you stretch your mind beyond the possibilities, what is the Earth, as you look at it floating in space? It's a circular object tilted at about 22, 23 degrees from the vertical. That's the angle of obliquity for the Earth. Currently, it's 23.4 degrees, I think, the angle of the tilt angle of the Earth. But it wasn't that in times gone past. It changes very slightly. It goes from about 22 degrees to about 24.5 degrees, roughly. So it changes with a 40,000 year cycle to it. But the Earth is a circular object floating in space, tilted at about 23 odd degrees from the vertical. And that's exactly what we see at Avebury. So we have this big circle with axis, a sort of north-south axis, and an east-west equator, and the two trackways, the two roadways, delineate that perfectly. And it's tilted about 22.5. In fact, it's exactly, because I've just got this enormous great surveyor's chart of Avebury and measured it, and it's 22.5 degrees tilted, exactly the same as the Earth is. So if you can broaden your mind beyond the normal possibilities, they have been drawing an image of the Earth on the plains of Wiltshire, which would suggest that they knew an awful lot more about the solar system, the cosmos, and the planets than we would give them credit for. But one of the ways of proving this was the smaller circles. So we have a small circle in the north of Avebury, and inside that circle there is a cove pointing to the. So where do we see a cove pointing to the northeast? Well, at Stonehenge, of course. It's a circle with a cove pointing out towards the northeast, towards the midsummer sunrise. But at Avebury, they rounded this circle by 26 stones. 26 stones times 2 is 52. The latitude of Stonehenge is 52 degrees north. Well, it's 51.2 actually, but 52 in round figures. In the southern hemisphere of Avebury, there's another circle, and inside that circle there's a crescent shape. So the circle that surrounds it is 28 stones this time. 28 stones times 2 is 56. Where, if we're looking into the southern hemisphere, what would we be looking at that might be on the 58th parallel south, somewhere in the southern hemisphere, that is crescent shape, a monument that is crescent shape? Well, there's no monument that's crescent shaped down in the southern hemisphere, but there is a chain of islands, and they're called the South Sandwich Islands, and they happen to lie exactly to the nearest few kilometers on the 58th parallel. And so if you are marking some permanent that's not going to be destroyed, you can find it again, that happens to be in the southern hemisphere, that is crescent, it's the South Sandwich Islands. And then why is this just boasting, you say, not just recording information, because it's fairly useless information, really. It's boasting about your technology and your capabilities and your knowledge at that time. You would know what the South Sandwich Islands looked like in the Neolithic era. How it's done? Well, that's a different question. Of course, we don't expect Neolithic man to be sailing around the southern hemisphere looking at the South Sandwich Islands. So it becomes all rather esoteric because it's outside our normal experience in our normal history. However, that's what it looks like. And so all I'm suggesting to people is have a look at it and say, does it sort of look familiar? I think it does. How it was achieved is another question, but there we go.
Exactly. I mean, given all the evidence, there must have been some sort of global civilization going on to at least 2500 BC. All these places align, don't they? So how on earth would they have done that? Do you have any idea at all? Was it some sort of civilization going around the globe and building these sites and teaching people what they were well versed in, or were people of all countries building these sites and in communication with each other? It's mind-boggling to me.
Well, it does seem that way. Of similar megalithic architecture in most of the continents of the world, all at the same time. That was difficult to explain without some sort of civilization that could traverse the globe. Why would everybody be building pyramids in megaliths beyond your normal expectations? You know, megaliths like we have in Baalbek, which weigh 100 tons, beyond our normal capabilities for a Neolithic type civilization, and yet they're doing that all around the world. There was one I found recently, which I didn't even know about because I've read all about these megaliths before. And you know, the common trilithon we have in Britain and in France is called a dolmen, where you have 2 or 3 uprights and stone on the top, and that's so sort of Northwest European. But then I happened to find a load of them in Korea, and apparently they're famous in Korea, and one of them I think in Sri Lanka. And so this exact same megalithic architecture, the dolmen, is worldwide. It's not just European. And be able to tell them the difference between them. The ones in Korea look exactly the same as the ones in Britain. So however it was achieved, there does appear to have been a megalithic society which could traverse the globe. Now, I don't necessarily believe in civilization, because if it's civilization that had any broad depth to it, you would find the archaeological record. I mean, you cannot hide a city. If there was a technical city, even one that was small, you know, say a population of 100,000 or something, but it was technologically advanced, you would find evidence of that city when you dig in the archaeology. You would find their metalwork, their electronics, their railways, their whatever they happen to have as their technology. You would find evidence for it. You can't hide that. The evidence for our society will be in the archaeological record for the next million years, more. You know, it's once it's up and buried, it's difficult to destroy. Our civilization, that, you know, the remains of it, if we happen to fail, will be there for millions of years. So the megalithic era would have to be a very small group of people that didn't leave a great deal of evidence behind them. Just the evidence of the megaliths themselves, and no evidence of their civilization that was inside it, suggesting that the civilization was very small. You know, 10,000 people instead of 1 million people. And so there was not much civilization to leave behind. And certainly they've not left behind any of the technology either. But that is to be expected in a way. Well, it depends how you regard who these people are, that they didn't want to leave any evidence of their past. I mean, if you look at their monuments, they're completely clean. You go to places like Stonehenge and Avebury, and there is no evidence there of how it was constructed, which is odd. So when they were repairing Stonehenge, because a lot of the stones were leaning over and they had to be reset before they fell, they lifted them up and cleared out the hole and then reset them. Some of them they reset with concrete to stop them falling over. But the interesting thing about when they took them out is the hole was empty. So there was no organic remains, there was no wood, there was no antlers, there was nothing that was underneath the stone that someone had dropped in there while they were digging the holes. You know, normally on a building site, all sorts of things get dropped in holes before they lay the concrete, you know. How to cover up all of your mess, just pour concrete. No one's going to know, because you're going to build a house or an office on the top of it. No one's going to know what's in your hole that's now covered in concrete. Well, it's been happening back in the Neolithic era. People would be dropping all sorts of stuff in the holes before they set the stone in, and then packed it with sarsen stones to stop it moving, of course, and then put the earth back on top of it. Anything could be dropped in that hole. But it wasn't. They were all nicely clean. So it's quite obvious that whoever was making these megaliths was going to great lengths to stop any, as it were, evidence of their construction from being dropped in the hole, which is odd, you might say.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Going back to the dolmens, the dolmens. What do you think they were built for? I think the official narrative is that they were meteorite shelters or something like that, which sounds a little bit far. Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard that one. People say that they were originally covered up with earth and therefore they were tombs. So it would be a mound of earth with this dolmen underneath it. But there are so many of them that have no earth. You have to wonder if that's true or not. It was doubtful that on every dolmen, all of the earth has been washed away, and you're just left with the dolmen there. So they might have been just sitting there. As expressions of your capabilities. It's like building a pyramid, or perhaps, or in modern term, like building a monument. I mean, what is the pillar in Trafalgar Square for? It's not really for anything, really. It's to celebrate a battle back in the 19th century with a big pillar and a statue stuck on the top of it. But it doesn't really have a great deal of utility in the modern world. But it's still there. We still have these big pillars with statues on the top of them. So I think it's something of that nature. It's a symbol of your power and authority, that you can build this enormous great set of trilithon stones. And other people cannot, you know. You must be a powerful king if you can make this enormous trilithon.
Just before we move on to our next question, I'd just like to ask you, do you think that sites like Avebury and Stonehenge were composite sites? Do you think that they were built in stages or all in one go?
Stonehenge and Giza, in a way, give clues that they were actually a grand building project that was designed from the ground up as you're alluding to, it's always said that there was, a whole series of eras that this town was built in over many, many generations, maybe hundreds of years. But the design of Stonehenge, like it's a Unitarian plan that was set out from day one, even maybe if it took a long time to build, which I don't actually think it did. Stonehenge was built as a single plan. You have the 4 station stones, which were set up at the very, very start of the building project. More or less the same as you would do with a modern building project. You would put up 4 stations or more where you would place your theodolites, and so you could survey the whole of the area that you're going to build your office block in, because everything needs to be referenced back to, as it were, the grand plan, ground zero, where you have these points where you put your theodolites and measure the position of every pillar you're going to build. Well, they did the same at Stonehenge. You have the 4 station stones, which form a rectangle, which happens to be a Pythagorean triangle, which shows that they understood mathematics as well. It's a 5, 11, 13, I think it is, Pythagorean triangle that forms the 4 station stones. And that forms the layout of Stonehenge. So the axis and the avenue of Stonehenge are all taken from that rectangle. And of course, the center of that rectangle is the center of the Stonehenge, and therefore the center of the Aubrey holes, and therefore the center of earthen henge that went around it. It's all predicated by this big rectangle formed by the station stones. So it's to me that this was a grand plan that was laid out as a single plan. Now, people might have been mucking around with it later, in later generations and centuries, but that doesn't mean it was not built as a single project. Things like the bluestones that are now inside the Stonehenge definitely weren't there to start with.
Yeah, because I think there's some holes that have been discovered outside of the main circle, and the conjecture is that the bluestones were once outside of the circle.
Yes, so outside the circle we have the Z holes, the Y holes and the Z holes, which are perfectly aligned with the sarsen stones. So there are 30 sarsen stones in the circle, and then we have 30 Z holes and 30 Y holes going further out from the Stonehenge, as if there was either rings of stones going around, another 2 sets of rings, smaller stones, because they're not very big holes, they're smaller holes. So you might have had rings of smaller stones, like the blue stones, could have gone in those 2 rings. It'd be 60 stones. And I think I'm forgetting for a minute how many blue stones there are. I think there's only about 60 blue stones, roughly. I'll have to look it up. But they could have been positioned in the Y holes and the Z holes. Alternatively, it's been suggested that they were for wooden posts, and so held up diagonal timbers that went on to the top of the Stonehenge to give it a roof. That's possible as well. It's not necessary, from what I think it is, as being a planisphere, looking out at the cosmos as a celestial monument. But it could have had a roof, and these could have been timbers that supported that roof. That's possible. And then the final ring is the ring of the Aubrey holes. So right out by the earthen henge, there's a ring of 56 Aubrey holes. And again, that number is very close to the number of blue. that are currently inside the Stonehenge.
Mm.
Stones could have been out there on the outer ring.
Mm.
So a whole larger ring of 56 blue stones going around the henge.
Mm.
That's possible as well. Because there's something I don't like in the archaeology of Stonehenge is they'll dig an Aubrey hole and they'll say, oh, it's got human remains in it. Therefore, it was for burials. Therefore, we can date the remains with carbon dating, and we can find a date for Stonehenge.
Mm.
Well, no, that's wrong on all counts. The evidence from Henge and Avebury and many other sites is these sites were kept clean. You don't put burials in your sacred site.
Mm.
Only Christians do that. Nobody else does. So if you find a burial, if you find remains in an Aubrey hole, that's probably from an era when the henge was no longer being used. And someone comes along, the place is abandoned, and they think, oh, well, this, used to be a sacred site. I'll put a burial there, and I'll drop some bones, because most of them were cremated. I'll drop some bones in the Aubrey hole, but that signifies an era when Stonehenge was abandoned, not when it was being made. So you can't take any carbon dating of burials at Stonehenge or antlers as they've in Avebury and say, oh, that indicates this henge was built.
Mm.
No, you wouldn't be allowed to leave your antler, because they used antler picks for digging out the henges. You wouldn't be allowed to leave your antler picking in the bottom. It would be cleaned out.
Mm.
So the evidence of an antler pick or a burial comes from the era from when Avebury and Stonehenge was abandoned, not when it was constructed.
Mm. Very interesting. I was told a really good story about, just going back to Avebury. I was told a really good story by Maria Wheatley, who I think you know Maria. She said that a few years ago, she took some children, school children, to the site, and had to leave them briefly for a moment. And there suddenly a storm occurred, quite a dramatic storm. And the children came running up to her and saying, Maria, the stones, they're singing. So she ran back with the kids, and sure enough, she says that the stones were actually making some sort of kind of a droney, vibrational sort of noise. What do you make of that? Stories like that? That's fairly incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, I've not heard of anything of that nature. I don't tend to believe in the overly esoteric world or the spiritual world. So necessarily believe anything like that until I'd actually seen it. I can't see a reason why it would be doing that. Apart from the fact that you've got a whole load of stones and you might get some resonance off it. They're echoing for, I don't know, peals of thunder or anything like that. If you have a whole ring of stones, you will get some echo resonance off them, perhaps. But yeah, no, I don't have any answer for anything of that nature.
Okay. Right, let's move on. Okay, question number 4 is, do you agree with those who think giants built Stonehenge? And if not, who did? And that's from Steve Moore. Thank you, Steve.
Well, Geoffrey of Monmouth thought so. Geoffrey of Monmouth said it was Merlin, I think, who was portrayed as a giant who was building Stonehenge. And funnily enough, that persevered even into recent times. In the 19th century, our dear Flinders Petrie, who's well known for his work down in Giza, did a survey of Stonehenge. One of the first people to do a proper building survey of the ruins. And he mentioning all of these mythical aspects from Geoffrey of Monmouth. And he ended up postulating, was it built in the post-Roman era? And Petrie thought this was a possibility because of the precession of the equinox, which is something I'm looking into at present. Yes, you can date things using the precession of the equinox, which alters the position of the sun. And of course, Stonehenge looks at the position of the sun. And so you might be able to get a date from that. Unfortunately, Petrie had his precession going backwards instead of forwards. And that's why he ended up with an AD date instead of a B date, which was unfortunate. But there you go. I suppose everybody makes a mistake every now and then. So that's why Petrie thought it might have been built in 700. But looking at precession, it's probably actually much older than that. And I'm now pushing the date of Stonehenge back something like 30,000 years BC. And there's no reason why not. I mean, what's the evidence for the megalithic era? If we get rid of all of that carbon-14 dating, which is intrusive, it wasn't original to the construction. The fact, as we've said, that you found some bones or organic debris or something on the henge does not mean that debris was coincident with the era of that henge. You've got no idea if it was intrusive or not from a later era. In which case, if you go via precession, and I'm giving a talk about this actually, Megalithomania, in May down in Glastonbury, so everyone's welcome to come down there and have a precession is a cycle. The ubiquity of the Earth is a cycle. It's the ubiquity that changes the angle of the sun as it looks down the avenue into Stonehenge. It's a cycle. Everyone has assumed you take the recent cycle. Well, there's nothing to say you have to take the most recent cycle. You can take it back to the next cycle. And that will be, depending on what solar cycle you're using, which planetary cycle you're using, is either another 25,000 years before or another 40,000 years before. So if we use next cycle going back into the past, that Stonehenge and Avebury could be very old indeed, tens of thousands of years old. And I'm going to go through that in my talk because I come up with a range of dates that you can choose from. And they're interesting dates. They're going back a long way into the past.
That's very interesting because I find that all these megalithic sites tend to be all categorized into 2500 BC. Everything's 2500 BC. It's almost like you don't need to be a historian. You just need to say 2500 BC.
Yes.
Yeah, pretty incredulous.
Everybody parrots the same thing, and they're looking for dates that back up that theory. I was just reading recently, because I'm doing some revision for this Megalithomania conference on Atkins. Atkins was the guy who did a lot of the more recent surveying work at Stonehenge. And he was reading Lockyer, and because Lockyer was working back in 1900. I think his survey was in 1901. And they had good equipment, in 1901. You could measure angles quite well in 1901. And he was saying that Lockyer got his survey wrong. So it would be nice if we could have actually a modern survey, because here we have Lockyer who's saying Petrie was wrong because his precession went the wrong way. And now we have Atkins saying that Lockyer is wrong because all his measurements are 0.25 of a degree incorrect for some, according to And I'm saying Atkins is wrong because his procession is demonstrably wrong because he's got two dates that are too close together. He's got a whole degree of displacement in procession and only 400 years between them. And you go, that can't be right. No. A degree of procession will make a much bigger difference than that to the dating of Stonehenge. But I've lost my train of thought there. What were we talking about?
The original question was, who built? Do you agree with those who think giants built Stonehenge? If not, who did? That was the original question. Coming back to it.
Yes, we've gone off that topic a little bit, haven't we? What I was sort of aiming at is that we don't even know the era, let alone who built it. So if we take it back to not recent times, you were talking about recent times. Oh yes, that's what I was talking about. You were saying everyone just says, oh yes, 2500 BC, because that's the standard answer. Atkins says exactly the same thing. He says in his paper, which was printed in Nature, I think, so this is a proper scientific paper, and he says, well, we don't have to look at the processional aspects of Stonehenge because we've now got carbon-14 dating, and we know it was 1600 BC, so we don't have to look at the angle of the avenue and the sun and procession. Oh, well, thank you. Can't we have another method of backing up what you've assumed from the carbon-14 dating? Use another method to try and get a consensus, and he doesn't. So yeah, it's disappointing. So it would be nice to have a proper modern survey with modern equipment to get the precise position, not only of all the stones, because I think we know pretty much the location of each of the stones, but where the sun actually rises in the modern era, so we can calculate, because they all seem to be giving a slightly different sunrise angle, which doesn't agree with each other. So I don't have anything to go on to give me an exact figure. They're up to a degree difference because Hawkins, I think it was, he was in the 1980s, so he's even later than Atkinson. And he's taken all his measurements from the heel stone, not the new. So when you start reading all of these reports, you don't know what they're looking at, heel stone or avenue. You don't know what type of sunrise they're talking about sometimes, talking about first glimpse or half sun or full sun. And of course, all of that makes a difference to what you mean by sunrise. There's a degree of difference between the first light and the sun sitting on the horizon. And that makes a hell of a difference to any sort of dating that you're wanting to do. So I'm trying to sort out all of those inconsistencies and get a range of dates that we can use for the processional and obliquity date of Stonehenge.
Okay, fantastic, Ralph. Let's go back to biblical history now. This one's come in from Mediocrities, and he asks, how do you explain how do you explain the Mar Thomas Church in India that is claimed to originate in AD 54?
Yes, I read a little bit about this in my Jesus King of Edessa book, because I came across this text. It's in the Gospel of Thomas. So if anyone wants to read about it, it's in the Gospel of Thomas, one of the apocryphal Gospels. And it has a great similarity with other books I'd been looking at. So it has a great similarity to the Doctrine of Addai, which is the story of Edessa, and also to little bits of Acts of the Apostles. So that I presume this is where he's getting it from, but anyway, the Gospel of Thomas is a story, well, without going about it in too much detail, about Thomas, who is the twin brother of Jesus. And of Thomas means twin, of course. In the Gospels, he was known as Thomas Didymus, which means twin. But if you look into the Nag Hammadi Gospels, he was called Judas. So now we have Judas Thomas Didymus was his name. But he has, some people complain that I give people too many names, but they had many names. So from my Adam Clarke, which is the great thesaurus of biblical history, no, I think you call it a concordance, basically. It's a commentary on every single verse in the Bible. That must have been a job and a half. You know, imagine doing that. I want to write a commentary on every verse in the entire Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelations. Yeah, I bet that took a lifetime. Anyway, he's very good at this chap. He's 19th century. I like my 19th century scholars. They were dedicated to their work, and he knows an awful lot of stuff.
They were more open-minded in the Victorian era with this subject.
Yeah, a lot of them were sort of gentlemen scholars, and they spent their whole lifetime working on these topics. And he knew his stuff. He spoke all of the languages. He had all of the books. So when you get a verse that's controversial, he will go back into 15 other Bibles, all in different languages from different regions. So he'll compare the Syriac and the Coptic and the Russian. He'll compare them all, the Arabic, or every different version you've got of the Bible. And it's amazing that every one will have a different verse. So there is no one standard Bible. Mainly talking about the New Testament here, but they will all have a very slightly different translation, especially for names of places and people and things like that. But anyway, we go off topic again. Anyway, he says that Thomas was called Thaddeus and Lebbaeus. Again, two words that mean the same in two different languages. So the name for Judas, who was the brother of Jesus, was Judas Thomas Didymus Lebbaeus Thaddeus. There you go. So there's 5 names for starters. And he goes off on a trip to India. And if I remember correctly, because it's a little bit confusing, but I think Jesus goes with him. And then we have this, they love these wonderful stories about these people who just go into these foreign countries and end up as advisors to the king. But anyway, he does something similar. And so he's in India and he's pretending to be Jesus, but then he's not Jesus and various things because they look the same, because they're twin brothers. And so they can trick people because they look the same, you know. So we have all that sort of stuff going on. And then he tricks the king into giving him money because he says he's a great architect and he'll build for him a great palace. And of course, he's tricking the king because he's not spending the money on a palace. He's spending the money on looking after the poor of India. And so what does he say to the king? I can't remember. He says something like, "Oh, king, you're not storing up treasures in this great palace. You're storing up treasures in heaven because you're looking after all of these poor people." Well, that is a copy of a story from the Talmud. But funnily, sorry,
Monobazus, isn't it?
Yeah, this is about Monobazus. So this is from Baba Batra. So it's talking about the kings of Adyabeni now. So when they're talking about India, are they talking about India, or are they talking about Adiabeni, which is supposed to be out in Mesopotamia? I don't know. Could be both, but they might be talking about Adiabeni, Edessa, basically. And King Monobazus says, my father stored up below, and I'm storing up treasures above. My father stored in a palace which can be tampered with, but I've stored in a place which cannot be tampered with. My father stored something which produces nothing, but I have stored something which produces real fruits. My father's gathered money, but I have gathered treasures of souls. It's the same story, the same proverb, you might say. But now it's not talking about India. This is talking about Edessa and Adiabeni. And that actually comes from the Talmud. It doesn't come from the other books we've looked at, which talk about Adiabeni. And of course, that's the same story that we get in the Gospels. It's Jesus, isn't it? It's Jesus who says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust does corrupt them, and where thieves cannot break through and steal them. For where your treasure is, there will be your heart also. So this is Jesus. This is from Matthew 6:20. This is Jesus saying exactly the same thing about storing up your treasures in heaven, not on earth. So this was obviously a very common proverb or parable, which was taught in many places, in many regions. Or you could say it's the same parable from the same person. Therefore, Jesus was something to do with the Edessan monarchy. And that's what the Gospel of Thomas is talking about, but it's saying India when it doesn't mean India. It probably means Mesopotamia. Don't know on that. Some people say they found evidence for Judas in India. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence for him being out there. He's supposed to be up in Kashmir. There's supposed to be a tomb up there somewhere in Kashmir.
I think there's a sect of Muslims, I think it's the Ahmadi Muslims, that believe that Jesus survived the crucifixion and then went on to India and preached out there.
Yes, well, there were lots of sects, of course, who were pushing various exoduses. We've seen evidence for many exoduses. And of course, they take their stories with them. And well, if you're taking your story there, why not take one of the apostles with you as well? Whether he's just in literary form, not, and just say, oh, well, you know, we went to India and so did the brother of Jesus. I don't know. It could be just a literary artifact rather than being real. But we don't have much evidence of it. But we do have evidence that many people recorded this particular story.
Okay. We best move on, Ralph, because this is rapidly becoming a 24-hour video. We're not even halfway there yet. Right. So
we've only got 20 more questions to go through, I believe. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So this one's coming from Heidi Burby, and she asks, why do you state that King Arthur was known as the most evil king in history?
Oh, yes. Yeah, she's talking about High History. High History, puzzling book. It really is. It's a history of King Arthur. It's a full history of King Arthur, Round Table, Camelot, all of the characters, the Lancelots, all the standard mob from Arthurian legend. But it's written from a very different perspective. It's written, I think, from the perspective of the enemies of Arthur, caught in his friends, and therefore it portrays Arthur as being the evil. It's also, I can't understand whether it's from a Christian perspective or from a perspective of someone who is highly critical of Christianity, because it gives Christian motifs in fashions you would not expect. So there is a wife who is being lashed by the evil husband, who is one of the knights of the Round Table. No, he's actually one of the enemies of the Arthurian Round Table. And he's a very cruel husband, and he lashes and whips his wife until her skin is hanging off. And then he gets a lance and he thrusts a lance through the side of his wife.
Mm.
And this is supposed to be a portrayal of Jesus, who is lashed and whipped and scourged on the way to his crucifixion, and then someone sticks a lance through his side. But it's a very dark story, I have to tell you. I think in a way this is making a mockery of the crucifixion story rather than being from the Christian perspective. And it's just a dark, dark story from start to finish. The story about the righteous king, and the righteous king kills his son and boils him and cuts up his son and gives pieces of his son's meat to all of his disciples, all of his supporters. And you think, oh, what on earth? And of course, this is a mockery of the Christian Eucharist. So the righteous king is God, who sacrificed his son and boiled him and cut his flesh up and given it to all the congregation, a Christian church. It's dark stuff. It really is. It's a funny. It's a funny manuscript, and it has this dead at the beginning saying, keep this manuscript safe and don't show it to anyone because it'll do this and do that. And yeah, interesting stuff. And this is, of course, also one of the manuscripts says that the original manuscript upon which this was based was Josephus Flavius. And that puts a spanner in the works. And of course, Joseph Flavius was the enemy of Jesus. So we do have the character that's on the opposite side of the story as enemy of Jesus. Remember, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Josephus chasing Jesus around Galilee in the AD 60s. That was one of the reasons I started into Arthurian legend, because this manuscript did not agree with the standard Arthurian story. But yeah, listeners, viewers, read it for yourself and see what you make of it. It's a strange story.
Is it one of the books that make up the Vulgate cycle, High History?
No, it's separate from the Vulgate, and I think it's earlier than the Vulgate. So it's quite an old manuscript.
Wow.
That goes back to the 12th, probably the 12th century, not even the 13th. It's a 12th century manuscript, so it's quite early.
Okay, let's try and fit in two more today, Ralph. Next question comes in from Justin D. Armand, and he asks, was there a Hall of Records at K2? If so, who put it there? And are the legends of Alexander the Great trying to locate it true?
Yes, we're going back to the megalithic era again here, aren't we? Yeah, this is kind of a speculative book on the megaliths, that the megaliths appear to be megalithic maps. So we were discussing with Avebury seems to be a map of the Earth floating in space. Well, I deduced the same from the Great Pyramid. It's difficult to explain, so I won't really explain it because, well, just go and read the book. It's in Thoth Architecture of the Universe, and it will show you the pictures of what I mean. I think the pyramid, the internal components of it represent a map as well, because a lot of the artifacts that are in the Great Pyramid don't make any sense in terms of a tomb or a temple or anything else. They were all blocked off anyway. You couldn't go into them. The only bit was open was the descending passage down to the rough cavern at the bottom of the Great Pyramid. That was always open, and we know that because Strabo tells us about it. He even describes the door, which was a bone that you could lift up. So you could go down to the bottom of the Great Pyramid. Which means there was no point for anyone making the Mamoon tunnel, which goes straight into the side, because the original door was always known about. So the only reason for making the Mamoon tunnel was to get something out of the pyramid, not to get into the pyramid. Of course, the Mamoon tunnel tracks its way exactly to the join of the ascending and descending passages within the Great Pyramid. It knows exactly which way it's going. And of course, the easiest way to achieve that, if you build it going outwards instead of going inwards, then you're on, right target. The rest of the chambers in the Great Pyramid were all concealed. They weren't open at all. And even once you're in there, the minor shafts in the Queen's chamber were concealed. You had to go and search for them. So nobody knew they were there. You've got the minor shafts in the King's chamber, which are obvious. They actually break into the chamber. And I think his name was Wayne. I'll remember in a minute. I think he was called Wayne. Wondered, and I'm not sure why he would wonder, but anyway, thought, well, if the King's chamber has got small shafts, then why hasn't the Queen's chamber? So he went around the whole chamber, poking pieces of wire into the joins between the blocks, and found an area where he could continue poking in a piece of wire for meter after meter. And so he had discovered the small shafts in the Queen's chamber. Dixon and Wayne, that was the name. And so he had a major discovery of a new shaft within the Great Pyramid. But these are very small shafts. They're only, what are they? They're about 30 centimeters wide and about 20 centimeters high. So it's soft. You can't get in there. You can only survey it if you have a piece of equipment that can actually go in that shaft and climb up it. So it's purpose designed, because it was blocked off at both ends, both in the chamber and at the outside. It was purpose designed that only a technical civilization could actually map that shaft. And we've only managed to map that shaft in the 21st century, because one of them has got some bends in it. So the original survey was done by Gantenbrink back in the 1990s. But one of the shafts was difficult to get around, and it's only been surveyed in the 21st century. So here we have a monument where you can only survey it once you're a technical civilization. And that's interesting. That's a good way of keeping a secret, isn't it? Because you've got no idea what these shafts are and where they go to and what angles they go up at until you're a technical civilization, unless you dismantle the whole of the pyramid. And so now we know all of the internals of the Great Pyramid, and you can draw a plan view and a cross section. And you can only see all of these angles and shafts in cross section. So it's almost as if we have a architect's diagram, cross section of the pyramid. And now use that diagram to use it, as I say, as being maps of the world. And I think they are, because they contain latitudes and longitudes like we found for Avebury and Stonehenge. And it seems to me, I won't go into it now how it looks like that, but it looks like it's pointing up into Himalaya. So it gives you a latitude and longitude, basically. And you can plot those latitudes and longitudes out.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so you get a position.
Didn't you once go to the Himalayas and visit the pyramid there?
Yeah, so I went up into the Himalaya to have a look at this. And there is a pyramid in the Himalaya. It's a
really
natural
big,
mountain, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a natural mountain, but I did sort of wonder whether it was totally natural. And this becomes very, of course, because it happens to be rather similar to the Great Pyramid itself. So it's a pyramid with a square base on it, aligned to the cardinal points, and with a causeway that comes out at the bottom of it at about 14 degrees, exactly the same as the Great Pyramid has. So it's almost like a larger cousin of the Great Pyramid. It's almost as if someone is copying what that mountain looked like and making a smaller version of it down in Egypt. So, like with the conundrum with the megaliths, which seem to be worldwide, continent-wide, using technology that we wouldn't expect from ancient Neolithic societies. It looks like we have the same here, with someone who was able to the Himalaya in a very early era, and then copy what they saw there and copy it as a pyramid in Egypt in megalithic architecture. So again, all very strange, all very esoteric, but I mean, that's what the data gives us. It won't be accepted by academia establishment, of course, because it's off on a... But unless you speculate on what are the possibilities, you will never actually increase your knowledge of a subject. And so that's what I've done. I've just presented the data, and you can make from that data whatever you like.
Just on the subject of the Great Pyramid at Giza, do you think there are any other chambers yet to be discovered?
I don't, because in my map, and I think the chambers form the shape of a map, I don't need any more chambers to make it work.
Right.
So I have a world map there already, and I don't need any other continent on my map. So I don't think there are any other chambers to be discovered, Bill.
Okay. And just last thing, have you seen the Bosnian pyramids, the alleged Bosnian pyramids?
Yes, the alleged pyramids. No, are natural. Limestone does this. So geologists. So I know my geology fairly well. Limestone tends to do this. It forms slabs, of course, and they're finding big slabs there. Well, yes, limestone does that. You know, if you've got strata of limestone that have a differential layer in between, a surface of, well, it's not a surface of discontinuity. It's the same strata, but you have different material that are being laid down. So you have limestone being laid down, then you might get a little bit of sand debris or mud debris forming shales, and then some more limestone. So you'll get a strata of weakness within the limestone, and it'll break along that strata of weakness. And you'll end up with slabs. Of course, many people down through the ages have used this phenomena for building, because it makes you a nice slab of rock that you can use for building. Using slate from a slate quarry, it will naturally fracture down a particular slice of that stone. And so you can have places like the Bosnian pyramids that look as though they're made of stones, but they're not natural strata. And so they're pyramids of natural rock. They're not man-made at all.
Okay. Right. Time is ticking on. So let's end on a couple of fun questions, shall we? This one comes in from Heidi Burberry, and she says, is there any place that you haven't visited that you would love to go to? Well, you've been to quite a few places, Ralph, so this could be tricky.
Yes, I've been to. I haven't done in of the Central American. I did a tour of America, but there's a lot of the pyramids and the megaliths in Central America I've not seen. So I'd like to do that. I also went back to Syria, and I wish they'd stop fighting in these regions so I can go back and research some of this stuff. I want to go to Emesa, which is down by Homs and Hammer, and of course that's been a hotbed of trouble for quite some time. And I want to go back to Hatra, which is over in Iraq, and of course that's been a hotbed of troubles recently as well. So yeah, because I've still not been to Hatra, been trying to go there for a long time. I got in contact with a tourist agent in Adiabeni, so near Mosul. No, it's still a little bit too dangerous to go out Hatra. So I'll have to wait a few more years maybe before going out there. But
that's a shame because
yeah, there are
clear links between Hatra and Edessa, aren't there?
Yes. There appear to be cultural links. The imagery looks very, very similar. The statues look very similar. And we have this small city which is set up near where Adiabeni was said to be, because Adiabeni was said to be Arbela, which is only like 50, which may be linked with the Edessan monarchy. So it would be nice. But I think most of it has been trash. A lot of the artifacts were taken to the Mosul Museum, but then, of course, ISIS broke them all up when they gained power of Mosul. But I was told, and I hope it's true, that they were just plaster copies and not the originals. So we await to see what actually happened to see if the original. But ISIS just went around there with sledgehammers and broke all of the statues. You know, they're near. I don't know how to describe them really. They're the worst ignorant thugs you can possibly get in the world. You know, they're worse than ignorant. They're nematode worms.
I've heard you describe them before as Neanderthals, and I personally thought that was a bit harsh on Neanderthals.
Yes, that's right. I've stopped using that phrase because everyone said you're giving Neanderthals a bad name. They were better than ISIS. Yeah, and they were. I mean, ISIS was so dumb. Well, they blew up the temple in Palmyra, which is a huge tragedy. I mean, it was one of the great surviving temples of the Roman era. And then they went and blew up the funerary towers. So they buried their dead in big square towers. But that's not a temple. But the trouble is, these people probably don't even know what it is. It's not a temple to any god. That's a burial chamber to dead people. And yet they disrespected it by blowing up. And it was a huge, great tower. And then they went and to blow up the amphitheater in Palmyra. And they were so dumb, they didn't know you cannot blow up an amphitheater, because the shockwaves just go up the sides of the amphitheater and just dissipate into nowhere. So it did no harm to it. Yeah, that's how thick they are. But there we go. That's ISIS for you.
Okay, let's end on a fun question, shall we? This is mine, Ralph. This is mine. So, could you tell the story of the time you were at a training event at work and the course leader was talking about what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom? This was one of your Facebook posts fairly recently. It did
Yes.
give me a good old laugh.
I've had several company. I won't mention who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go on to that one, they also gave out a training course that you all had to sign to say you believed in global warming.
Mm.
And you had to sign it and saying, I go along with this.
Mm.
I go along with your inclination. Don't give me that, chaps. So what I did is I got all of my climate data, because I happen to be a climate scientist, as it were, because I've written a peer-reviewed climate paper. And I got together all my data and all of the graphs, which are contrarian graphs, because they go against the standard narrative that you'll see on CNN or the BBC. And I sent that to everybody in the company on a grand BCC to us in the whole company, saying, I don't agree with your propaganda, basically. And I did think I would get into trouble, that this would cause a stink. And would you believe nobody replied from management? I mean, there was lots of people from down below who replied and said, nice one. But nobody in management replied. A bit strange, but there we go. But yeah, I had another one. We have these training sessions every year where they have to train you to be a good manager, and a good manager has to be nice to his people and all of this sort of business. And it's become successively more and more woke as time has gone on. Very much so. It's a very different course now to when I started, 35, 40 years ago. But anyway, this really woke lass came on, and she said, how did she phrase this? She said, the only thing that separates humankind from the animal kingdom, and this was on a Zoom call, of course. In days gone by, we did this in the classroom, and it was much funnier then. We used to have fun with these instructors then, but this was a Zoom call, COVID. So we're all sitting there on a big COVID Zoom call, and she said, the only thing that separates mankind from the animal kingdom is that we can plan ahead. So I just pressed the unmute button and I said, squirrels. And the entire class just collapsed with laughter. And that was the end of the course. So, I mean, no one else could take it seriously. Everyone was just laughing and giggling and shared video cameras because they were. But I mean, that's how stupid it has become. We have an instructor of a large company, thousands of employees, who is saying something as daft as that we are the only animals that will plan ahead. Don't give me that, To indoctrinate people, let's have some, sound science and sound facts behind what you're teaching, not this global warming business, which I picked apart quite expertly, or this absence about society and so on that they're trying to plug, So yeah, that was quite fun. I enjoyed that one.
Brilliant. Yeah, I do love.
But I bet, yeah, indeed it is. But I bet they haven't changed the training course. I bet they've not changed it. It's probably exactly the same.
Probably even worse by now, I would imagine. Okay.
Probably.
We should probably end it there. So thanks very much, Ralph, for being open to this. I really enjoyed it myself. Thanks to all the viewers for their brilliant questions. I'm hoping that we can do this again at some point in the future. It might even be alive. You never know. Please like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you again. Cheers, Ralph. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Bye-bye.
Cheers.